An even earlier necessity, which is a study by the Israeli government of what we want and what we will suggest on such matters as method and time and procedure. But we have definitely been told that this means, in the United States interpretation, direct negotiation, and that this is the only interpretation that they know of and that they will insist on it. But there are many questions to be asked about auspices and place and time and venue, and if I don't say anything to you about that, it isn't from a mere desire to withhold information from you, although there is always that perverse instinct when a politician faces newspaper men. It is really because we have not yet decided.
Yes, sir, Mr. Speaker.
The military spokesman late this afternoon said that there was a strong Egyptian attack in the Suez City area. What effect will that have on this second ceasefire?
Yes, I haven't come here. I was asked about our military spokesman's announcement of an Egyptian attack in the Suez Canal area. I'm not going to usurp the functions of the military spokesman. I think in the last few weeks, he's one of the few people who have had a job even more complicated than mine. So I'll let him do his work and not comment on military matters here. But I'll only say, as I said to Mr. Ben Porat in Hebrew, that although we certainly are aware of the fact that the early history of the ceasefire is an unhappy one, it just hasn't taken hold, we understand from our own past experience, and our American friends spoke of other experiences, that there is usually a time lag between the official time limit and the hour at which the fire dies down on all fronts. So we have not yet reached a conclusion that the whole thing is over and that there's nothing to hope for. What I will say, if some days pass in this situation, I'm not going to commit myself now, but as of this day, we have not reached that conclusion, and we hope that the Egyptians will honor the commitment that they've taken, especially as they have observers on their side, if they need any specific communication with us.
Before we go on with the questions, may I make a very happy announcement? The blackout has been cancelled. Yes, sir, you are next.
I think I'd like to say that says, rather confirms my last remark that we have not despaired of the ceasefire.
Yes, sir.
According to your words, since we don't get an answer from Egypt about the prisoners, does it mean that there's no ceasefire?
If I wanted to say that, I am familiar with all the words that you've used, and I would have put them together and said it. No, I didn't say that. But the idea that there can really be a durable ceasefire without a very urgent treatment of this problem is not valid, and especially it's a test. It's a test of the two sponsoring powers, and I know what one of them thinks. I believe if it depended on one of them, things would have come out differently. But we understand that they have committed themselves to each other to use their strongest possible influence to bring this about. And I think the whole fate of the resolution in respect of the ceasefire and the negotiation will depend very much indeed on how this matter works out in the very early future.
Yes, sir. Excellent.
Comment on what Dr. Kissing said to you was that he'd been told by Moscow that under no circumstances were they prepared to see the Arab nations abandoned, whatever the ultimate consequences.
I think if you'd like to get Dr. Kissinger's views, you're almost in time for his press conference, which is going to be held, I think, today. I'm not going to divulge what he said to us, except sometimes to give a general impression on some matters. In fact, some of the impressions of the United States can be read in the policy statement of Ambassador Scali and in the press conference of Ambassador McCloskey.
Yes, sir.
You said in New York last week that Israel was prepared to make important compromises that mean the giving up certain occupied territories. Yes. Are you prepared to say in advance, before conferences start to take place, what Israel is prepared?
No, of course not, because if I were to say that in advance, I would be negotiating with you instead of negotiating with the Arab governments at parties around the table. I'd like to say really why I have never joined the map drawers in Israel, although to have your name attached to a specific peace map is a status symbol for Israeli politicians and journalists. The reasons briefly are these. Firstly, if you invite us in public to state what are for us the indispensable elements of a peace boundary, you are almost, and if you ask the Arabs to do that, you are inviting us to do the impossible, to project ourselves in an atmosphere of non-negotiation into the specific psychology of negotiation. These are two different psychologies. Before negotiation, the atmosphere is polemical, tactical, rhetorical. In negotiation, the atmosphere is pragmatic, concrete, empirical, and to the other moods in the negotiator's mind, there is added what I call the negotiating mystique, namely a tremendous reluctance to get out without an agreement. Now, all these create a certain intellectual inventiveness that is very difficult indeed to predict. Moreover, I've defined negotiation, since the question seems to follow me from New York to here. He may have heard me say sometimes that negotiation is by definition a process whereby nobody comes out with 100% of what he hoped to achieve at the beginning. Therefore, anybody who defines his position in advance, if he knows what he's about, is going to add a certain percentage. So you're really inviting polarization of positions. We want to make the Arab governments, to induce them to listen seriously to our concerns and preoccupations, including about the boundaries. And we want them to hear it, and we want to hear what are their preoccupations and to reach a conclusion accordingly. I understood from studying Dr. Kissinger's techniques that in not a single one of the settlements achieved in Europe or in Asia was anything achieved by public rhetoric instead of private negotiation. I'll only say one thing, however, that has arisen as a result of the Day of Atonement war. All Israelis, I hope and believe all Israelis, are going to be even more convinced now than before of the importance of this question of the defensible boundary within any settlement, because I can only repeat what some of you may have heard me say in the General Assembly. We have this traumatic exercise of imagination. Supposing that those 3,000 Egyptian tanks and those 2,000 Syrian tanks, with those 800 Egyptian aircraft and those hundreds of Syrian aircraft and the anti-tank weapons and missile systems had all been launched at us, not from the Suez Canal hundreds of kilometers away, but from the old mandatory boundary, a few miles from our settlements and not very many miles from Tel Aviv. Or imagine that the Syrian thrust, which developed a surprising first momentum, had started not from over the Golan Heights, but from the Golan Heights directly down into the upper Jordan and Galilee. Can anybody imagine where the first momentum would have carried them and what the catastrophic consequences would have been? In other words, those who said, how wrong were those who said that it doesn't matter where the boundary is, and how right we were in not putting ourselves back into such situations of vulnerability. In other words, that is the question. Now, those who propose June 4th or Harrogate speeches are asking Israel to put its head into a noose, are asking us to put ourselves in a position which would really compel a preemptive strategy. I would refer you here to the interesting report of the Institute of Strategic Studies published just after the 1967 war, saying that the previous armistice lines, those which existed until the 4th of June 1967, compelled a preemptive strategy. That was not the case with the ceasefire lines across which the attack was launched on the Day of Atonement. Of course we don't say that those are the only lines which have this quality, but there has to be the kind of boundary delimitation and security balance which would not open up that nightmare recollection. So whatever the boundary proposals are there. This is now an even more important factor with us, and the Arab governments are responsible for intensifying even more the conviction that that is a central point that must be negotiated and is not going to be frittered away by a declaration.
Mr. Hoffman.
Mr. Prime Minister, you mentioned that the total release of prisoners would be essential for the ceasefire, essential condition of the ceasefire. We also heard that the cessation of the blockade at Bab el-Mandeb is also essential. Would you say that if the prisoners aren't quickly released or Bab el-Mandeb blockade not ceased, that Israel would consider the ceasefire as non-existent?
I understand your desire to have an ultimative headline, and you will understand my refusal to give it to you. At the moment, the ceasefire is composed of many elements which should work themselves into a kind of a legal regime. The ceasing of fire is, of course, one of the elements. The abandonment of all kinds of blockade is another. Prisoners is another. And it's very common to put these into some documentary form. But the ceasefire is composed of several elements, and we're going at them one at a time, beginning with the cessation of fighting, prisoners, and all these other matters. And when all these have been settled, one can say that the ceasefire will have a certain stability.
Mr. Nasser, please.
Based on your conversations with Dr. Kissinger, what is your interpretation of the word auspices in the UN Security Council resolution? Does it mean the UN? Does it mean the big two? Or something else?
My interpretation of the American position is that it means whatever the parties agree to. In other words, that the two powers that sponsored the resolution are not going to dictate the auspices. They might make themselves available as one of the alternatives, but they're not going to insist on it. Therefore, this is a decision that the Israeli government has to examine and take. And you must understand we hadn't taken it. If you knew the timetable, we sat after the Knesset until about 2 in the morning, following the Security Council. And then there was a problem of the ceasefire breaking down, and General Silasvo and the Prime Minister was to come here and meet somebody else at 4 in the morning. Incidentally, for the scientists here, we'd like to say that those who declare that human beings cannot live without sleep, we refute that theory. So we really have not got beyond what we're doing now, which is to try and get the ceasefire on its feet.
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Ivan, have you any assurance through Dr. Kissinger or any other way that the Arab states, Egypt in particular, are willing to participate in the negotiations specified in paragraph 3 of that resolution? Have you received those assurances from Dr. Kissinger or anyone else?
I don't believe that Dr. Kissinger would claim to be able to speak for the Egyptian government. Let us be very prudent and careful. What do we know now? We know that the Soviet and American governments accept this principle, that they have recommended it respectively to Egypt, Syria, and Israel. We also know that the Security Council has unanimously endorsed this objective. That includes some countries which are very close indeed to the Arabs, rather closer than we would like them to be. So that there is some belief that apparently in the minds of the two sponsoring powers that Egypt will accept it. I believe that Egypt has accepted. I don't want to speak for Egypt. I'm sure they wouldn't appoint me as their spokesman. I believe that they have accepted not only the ceasefire, but they have accepted Resolution 338, and that's the number that you're going to hear a great deal about. Security Council Resolution 338, I understand they have accepted, and that's an integral whole, which includes number 3. But really, Mr. Smith, the test will come, I would imagine, in the next few days or weeks.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Rebel, haven't you been doing, by expressing yourself about the safe boundaries just now, what you earlier said, a couple of minutes ago, you were not going to do, namely negotiating in this conference room?
No, I draw a distinction between stating the existence of a problem, because otherwise you might assume wrongly that we would go, that any boundary would do. Well, not any boundary would do, and there's one boundary we know will not do. But between that algebraic principle and how you translate it into concrete facts. There's a whole vast range, all the way between what we will not do, and that's to say return to the 4th of June 1967, and what we do not claim, which is that the ceasefire of lines of October the 5th are the only possible boundaries. And we have accepted the principle of the Security Council resolution again, so that there is an element of withdrawal, but at what point in that huge area of options we will come to rest, that must depend on the negotiation.
Yes, a gentleman in back of the last television camera.
Next question. The history of the Arab governments in this conflict has been to accept only a ceasefire and never accept loss. What would Israel do if that is again the case? The Arab governments refuse to recognize paragraph 3 and simply return to a situation you had after 1967, a ceasefire only and no talks.
In that case, let there be a ceasefire only, although we would regret that for very many reasons. In other words, we can't force them to talk, but we assume that the influence of the sponsoring powers and of the Security Council will be brought to bear on having something beyond the ceasefire. After all, here is the paradox. It was the Arab states who said all the time that you cannot have just a ceasefire with no hope of some dismantling of the ceasefire situation in favor of something more, at least closer to what they would want, even if they can't get all that they want. In fact, it was their charge, and it's important I should say something on this, that they went to war on the 6th of October for a specific reason. They gave up the idea of the invisible naval battle at Sukhna and Zafarana, the most intangible battle in all of naval history, for the simple reason that it never took place. They gave that up and they went over to another rationale. They were frustrated. They had nothing else to do. Either the ceasefire was going to perpetuate itself or they had to change it by war. I want to say here that that is not true. And historically, it's very important to put on record they had a third possibility, which was, having accepted the ceasefire for years, to accept it for a few more weeks and then to respond to the negotiating opportunity that was offered to the Egyptian foreign minister and to myself by the American Secretary of State on October the 4th and October the 5th. In other words, they knew very well that his idea was that sometime in November, for certain constitutional Israeli reasons that are probably no secret to you, he wanted to know if I would come back. I said if my estimate of the election results are correct, then I would. And I know he put that situation, that question also to the Egyptian foreign minister, so that we could have come back and discussed the prospects of dialogue with somebody who, after all, had not been totally unsuccessful in launching dialogues out of deadlocks. And therefore, the great historic fact is that they did have the opportunity to negotiate. They chose war. They could have talked. They decided to shoot.
Take the gentleman in the back, please.
Much of the continuing fighting appears to involve or to be directly related to the large Egyptian force isolated on the east bank of the canal. Given the achievement of an enduring ceasefire, would Israel treat these troops, if their supplies do deplete, as impersonal prisoners of war, or would you allow resupply of the territory they held at the time of the ceasefire?
This whole situation is so new, the problem of troops and where they are and whether they stay where they are or what is done with them. It's so much linked with the military balance of a ceasefire that I must take refuge in my civilian status and invite you to put the question to our military spokesman, or if the defense minister comes here again, and I shall be just as curious as you are to know what the answer is.
Ed, please.
Are you still confident, sir, that there's been no prefabrication of any element of a solution by the Russians and Americans in order to obtain this agreement for the UN resolution?
We have been told quite specifically that nothing was agreed in Moscow beyond what is contained in the Security Council resolution and certain other matters which were explained to us as lying outside the resolution, such as the prisoner question, for example. And we were told by the Secretary of State with great emphasis. Even going beyond that, I understood from him even before the war and again later that insofar as the United States is concerned, its philosophy, at any rate his philosophy, is that those who use good offices should not become the authors or the sponsors